Welcome everyone who is joining the CSRD Prep Series webinar on materiality. My name is Thomas van der Molen, and with me Romina Andrade, my co-host of today. Let's give everyone a moment to join in. I'm seeing the number going up. Let's see if it stabilizes at some point. With us is also Anja de Jager, our marketing lead in the background, in the chat. If you have any questions during the webinar, please already put them in there. We'll try to keep an eye on it during the webinar to see if we can integrate any of the questions that come up. And otherwise, at the end of the session, we have some time for really the Q&A part of this webinar. We will really be focusing on the topic of materiality. So it could be that some questions you may have about CSRD in general or about other specific topics within this CSRD framework will be addressed in upcoming webinars or via a different medium. But please share with us everything that you want to know, that you want to ask, that you don't understand, and obviously anything that comes up during the webinar. Maybe we can go already to a small introduction from our side. As I mentioned, my name is Thomas van der Molen. I am one of the senior sustainability consultants at Nexio Projects, and I've worked with Nexio for close to 2 years now. I do a variety of different projects and types of services, and materiality is definitely one of the ones that I love very much and have been working on developing really our approach to make sure that that aligns fully with CSRD over, let's say, the last half a year, very intensely also with Romina. So maybe, Romina, if you also want to take a quick moment to introduce you to everyone that's attending.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Thomas. Hello, everyone. My name is Romina. I'm a sustainability analyst here at Nexio Projects. I started working in consultancy after earning a master's in global business and sustainability from Erasmus University, where I devoted a lot of my research and specialization towards materiality and the development of best practice materiality assessments. So very excited to be joining you all today.
Perfect. Thank you, Romina. And then maybe just nudging our colleague Anja. So we'll move to the page with the agenda, and then I will walk you through what it is that we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to start off really with a bit broader. What is materiality? Where does it come from? How can we define it? We're going to look at some practical examples, particularly about what we call double materiality. So that's really the type of materiality that is mandatory for CSRD and also necessary if you want to report along GRI guidelines. Then we're going to dive into a little bit more in depth. What are the topics that you should include within your materiality assessment? And then obviously the juicy part on how to actually conduct a materiality assessment. And we will make sure to keep enough time for the Q&A so that we can really have some interaction going on with all of you. Yeah, passing it on here to Romina for a moment.
Yeah, of course. So let's start with a little poll to get a sense of who's joining us here today. The question is, have you ever conducted a materiality assessment? Maybe while you all take a second to answer that, Thomas, maybe you can take us through a little bit of what results you expect here, especially with CSRD coming up.
Thank you, Romina. I think it's an interesting question. I'm seeing the different options we have here is yes, no, but this year we will, and no, it's unclear when we will. Obviously, a lot of you will be joining us, particularly because of the CSRD coming up, and with that, obviously, becoming aware that the materiality assessment is something that will have to be done. Some of you might have already done it and want to know also really what is the added layer or requirements that CSRD is really putting into that. And what I've been noticing is that definitely some larger companies that are a bit more mature already on their sustainability journey, let's put it like that, they oftentimes have done a materiality assessment, sometimes actually have also involved really external stakeholders in that materiality assessment. But what it oftentimes has been so far is that companies really do their own research in a variety of the industry benchmarks that we have, like ISSB, MSCI, maybe basing it on the activated criteria coming from EcoVadis. So a lot of companies that have started their sustainability journey, they will have a sense of what is materiality or what are the material topics for them. But most of them, I would say, have probably not yet done a complete materiality assessment. And I think many will be planning to do so in the upcoming year. So let's have a look at the results. Well, I'm seeing that indeed almost 50% of you have already done a materiality assessment. 34% say that it will happen this year, and some 18% are still unclear on when the materiality assessment will take place. So thank you everyone for joining us on that poll, just to get a little bit better idea of where everyone is standing.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, everyone. Based on that, for those of you who have not conducted a materiality assessment yet, we're going to start with a little bit of the basics. So mainly explanation of what is materiality. Materiality is traditionally about identifying the sustainability topics and issues that have an impact and influence on your company. So material topics are those that are most important or relevant to your company, and therefore where the greatest extent of risk and opportunities are, making them crucial to the decision-making and strategy development of your company. And this is a concept that has existed for a long time now, but is largely being replaced through pressure of legislation such as the CSRD, as well as societal paradigm shifts on how companies interact with sustainability. And so in present day, we often see the term materiality in itself referred to double materiality. So what is double materiality, and how is it different than what we're talking in a more traditional sense? Double materiality is composed of two perspectives. Firstly, we have our previously mentioned traditional take, formerly known as the financial perspective, which focuses on how sustainability issues, such as climate, for example, influence the viability of a company's financial success. This is also known as the outside-in perspective, and that's a reference to the fact that with this lens, we are perceiving the influence of external topics into the company's internal operations, specifically their profitability. The contribution that double materiality makes is in the impact perspective, which focuses on whether the company itself is connected to actual or potential significant impacts on external parties, such as people or the environment. So simply put, the impact perspective views a topic as material when the company's activities impact the topic or issue at hand. And conversely, to the financial perspective, it's also known as the inside-out perspective for this reason. So why is it important to talk about double materiality then?
So I think there's 6 main points that we were able to identify about why a double materiality assessment is the right thing to do at this moment. First off, obviously, and that's really in line with the webinar series that we're doing for compliance purposes. If CSRD applies to your company, then you will have to do a double materiality assessment, including external stakeholders, looking at both the perspectives of indeed how is your company affected by several of the issues that are around sustainability, both social and environmental ones, but then also really taking the impact perspective of how is your company impacting those issues, right? The more strategic angle that links to really is making sure that you focus on the right things, right? Because we don't want to invest things in making our company more sustainable, only to discover that we weren't actually focusing on those topics that most for our company. So beyond compliance, we feel that the materiality assessment is really at the core of setting out your sustainability strategy to ensure that you focus on the right topics from the start and are also able to align your reporting with that, right? Understanding your impacts and the impact that you have on stakeholders, what your stakeholders find most important about the impacts that your company is generating. It highlights both risks as well as opportunities, right? And it doesn't mean that the things that come forward from a materiality assessment are things that you're doing wrong or that you're not developed in at all. It can very well be that you have been already focusing on the right things, right? But understanding where those impacts are, where those risks and opportunities lie, that is really valuable in order to, again, feed into your sustainability strategy and your sustainability agenda. What we're also seeing, let's say as an added benefit to things, is really that element of collaboration, both internally with a variety of different departments that will need to also be involved within this process, both in terms of tapping into what they think are the most material topics, as well as let's say picking up on those different topics in order to then implement those into your sustainability agenda and really roll that out. But also the external collaboration with stakeholders that might otherwise be relatively far away from the decision making of your company, really seeking that collaboration and making sure that you're able to include their voices in that process is super, super important and valuable in our experience. I kind of covered this one in impacts already, but the assessment of the business risk and business opportunities, and knowing that you focus on the right things, that is really one of the core things of doing a materiality assessment. And a lot of times, as I just mentioned already, companies have done something on materiality already. They've either done something from a more single materiality perspective. A lot of the databases, unfortunately, do focus on impacts of sustainability issues on the company rather than really the other way around, because what the company does on those issues is also a little bit less definable per industry and really comes down to a company-to-company approach, because every company does it differently, right? So that's really where it also comes in, that we use the materiality assessment to validate those assumptions that you might already have. If those are 100% aligned, that's perfect, right? Then you have already been focusing on the right things, and this gives you the validation to say, this is where we're going to continue focusing on. If not, it allows for an important calibration of the topics that you find most important and are able to loop that back in. So if we look at the next slide and really how CSRD has been coming up in the world, so to say, we're seeing 20 times more non-financial disclosure requirements compared to 5 years ago. So that's a huge increase. We're seeing that the global 250 largest companies are 96% of them is reporting on sustainability efforts since 2020, and the CSRD in Europe will apply to more than 50,000 companies. So even if CSRD does not directly apply to your company at this moment, you will, beyond those 50,000, you will also be impacted in the upcoming years. As your clients are starting to report on this, they will also start asking for information from you. So being already prepared, even if it doesn't directly apply to you, is super important. So let's have a look to whom CSRD does apply. It's really listed companies in the European Union, or companies that have a large, have a subsidiary here in the EU, and they need to meet 2 out of these 3 criteria. So that's 40 million or more in revenues, 20 million or more on the balance sheet, and more than 250 full-time employees. If you meet 2 of these criteria, then CSRD applies to you as of 2024. So that's just good to see as the basis, I think. Then, yeah, I think it's time for some practical examples, Romina, to really make this tangible for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. I know that we're throwing definitions out there for you, so it would be more practical to go through some examples that would let you visualize and tangibly grasp what we really mean when we say outside in and inside out. So for starters, let's say that you're a large company that primarily makes revenue from selling seafood. You have a global operation, but unfortunately, you've noticed that recently global fish stocks are depleting. Now, this can be for many reasons, but the take you take from a perspectives and double materiality will impact the way that you see this. So, for example, from a financial lens, evaluating a decrease in fish stocks is seeing a decrease in your inputs, and that is going to negatively affect your company's future revenue opportunities. That's a direct connection there from decreasing your material inputs to a decrease in your profitability. But let's say that you're becoming more aware of the CSRD's double materiality requirements, and so you've already begun to think about this issue from an impact perspective. What would change in your thought process here is mainly taking the consideration of potentially one of the reasons the fish stocks are lowering being overfishing, and that your company's activities may actually be negatively impacting marine biodiversity levels. So while from a financial lens, we only assess the impact of depleting fish population on the company profitability, from the impact lens, we can realize that monitoring fish stocks as to avoid overfishing could be a course of action to help your company's continuity. So that's a really direct example from a more environmental sustainability side. let's look at something from a bit of like the social side of sustainability. And let's say that your company has conducted a employee satisfaction survey. Now, we know that this wouldn't apply to any of you, but for the sake of the example, and bear with me, let's say that the results suggest that employees are largely dissatisfied and unmotivated. Someone coming from a strictly financial perspective will see an unmotivated workforce as rightfully a threat to productivity and might find that the appropriate course of action is to replace the workforce. However, someone coming from an impact perspective might stop to think about the influence that the company's activities and governance potentially may be having on the employee satisfaction and motivation. So the course of action here would change to assessing and implementing the necessary changes to help the current workforce satisfaction level and, in effect, enhancing the overall working conditions of the company as a whole. And that's really the key point we're trying to make here. Double materiality will change the way you define future decisions and strategies. So with that, we hope that it's clear to everyone that what we mean when we say the inside out and the inside in the outside in perspectives, and how they influence the risks and opportunities that are identified respectively for material issues.
Thank you, Romina. If we can just go back to the previous slide for a moment. I'm seeing a question popping up here in the chat. Asking whether we mean dissatisfied employees and not unproductive employees. And just to re-emphasize what Romina just said, we do really mean that from a single materiality, traditional business first focus, a unproductive and dissatisfied workforce, they go hand in hand in a lot of cases. If people are dissatisfied, productivity drops, which from a traditional lens is seen purely as a business risk, which then decreases overall productivity. And from a double materiality, the company might wonder also, what are we actually doing in order to increase and affect employees' satisfaction and therefore in turn productivity from a positive side. So what can we do to better our impacts on those issues that have something to do with sustainability? So then indeed, let's go to the topic list that we want to include. We've started off here with a overview on really the sector agnostic standards with regards to CSRD. So as you can see on the left, it starts with some what they call cross-cutting standards, things that every company will have to report on. This involves some general principles that they want you to follow, defining and elaborating on your strategy, your governance model, how you approach your materiality assessment, and really explaining how you're following all the requirements that CSRD is putting in front of us. And then they're following the classical ESG model, right? Environment, social, and governance. Below it, they have given a number of sector agnostic topics upon which every company will need to start reporting. I won't go through them, but you see them here on the screen. Then what is still in development, and we're really hoping that this will be launched as soon as possible, are the so-called sector-specific standards, and also the special standards that are meant for SMEs, for whom probably the reporting requirement will be a little bit less intense than for larger companies, right? So it's going to be super important to keep an eye on those sector-specific standards, to also be able to include those into your materiality assessment when they are launched and when you're planning to execute such an assessment. Now, if we look at what we have traditionally been working with a lot is EcoVadis. Nexio Projects is very much known for its consultancy on EcoVadis. Just nudging Anya here for going to the next slide so we can have that overview. EcoVadis focuses on basically four pillars. Basically, three of them are the same as what we were just looking at: environment, and then what they call labor and human rights is what we would call social, and then ethics, for a large degree covers the governance element of it, and they add sustainable procurement. So what we have done is really try to create an overview of what not only CSRD says, but also what GRI includes and what EcoVadis includes. So on the next page, we are giving the overview of what, in our view, is currently the most up-to-date generic topic list that you can basically start your materiality assessment from. Our advice is not to exclude anything from this list and really include all these topics, because even if you assume at this moment that something is not material to your company, it's better to let the materiality assessment express that, and that it comes back. For example, if we think that child forced and compulsory labor is something that at your company is not relevant at all, it could very well be, because you might be located in a European country where legislation is very tight on that, and you know for sure that it's not happening. But you might not actually be aware of the risks that are present throughout your value chain at your suppliers, or maybe at your tier 2 suppliers, for example. So getting that validation from the materiality assessment about whether or not these topics are of relevance to your company, that's where really the materiality assessment comes into play. On the other end of the spectrum, adding topics to this generic topic list with which you start the assessment, I would advise to be careful with it, but also allow yourself to add what you think is missing, right? We have obviously compared the CSRD requirements with the GRI requirements with EcoVadis. We're actually also overlaying that with sustainable development goals and with several other frameworks to really make sure that this generic topic list is as comprehensive as possible, and that we have an alignment between the topics that are in here and how they should then be reported on according to each of these standards. But if you want to add something that you feel does not fit within any of these topics, then it's perfectly fine to also add that to the list and include that in the survey that you run with your stakeholders. So we just wanted to basically gift you this topic overview. If you want to go and go ahead do a materiality assessment by yourselves, this could really be a good starting point to base the inclusion of which topics on. Romina, do you maybe want to go into a little bit of the difference between GRI and CSRD? Because a lot of the participants might be familiar with GRI, but then now CSRD is coming up.
Yeah, for sure. And I actually saw a question in the chat that outlined the differences between the GRI and the questioning if there's going to be an overlap or CSRD is going to be expecting more. As Thomas mentioned, there are still some sector-specific topics missing from CSRD, so that is not entirely defined yet. But the list that we provided you is an encompassment of GRI and CSRD topics defined so far. So that is really like an encompassed holistic view on the potential material topics that you can look into. And the reason that we recommend not necessarily excluding any topics pre-materiality assessment from this topic list is because there is a significant difference between GRI and CSRD, particularly in their approach to disclosure requirements. So while when reporting with GRI, the reporting entities are free to decide on what topics to disclose, under the CSRD, reporting entities need to disclose on all material topics. And in all honesty, this is a complex exercise. So to make reporting requirements attainable, the EFRAG have introduced the rebuttable presumption principle. That is a mouthful, but what does this mean? Anyone who has ever watched a law show or movie of any kind might be familiar with the phrase innocent unless proven guilty. And this is what the rebuttable presumption encompasses. It is the argument that is held true until proven incorrect. And in the context of the CSRD, it means that topics will be considered material unless valid justification can be provided for omitting certain disclosure requirements. And then the entity need not report on said topics. But because it can happen more often than not that certain topics are immaterial to companies, performing a double materiality assessment can be a way to validate and justify the fact that a company is not reporting on certain disclosures. So crucially, in some cases, it may be difficult to determine materiality or immateriality, specifically because, as we mentioned, these sector-specific topics are not defined yet, and also because the valid justification is still somewhat ambiguous. So we recommend, to reemphasize what Thomas said, gathering key performance indicators on the topics that may be borderline or in doubt, while more clarity is being defined for CSRD, and looking at our holistic topic overview as a sort of guideline on these measures, and then performing the materiality assessment in order to validate and justify why certain topics or disclosures can be omitted. So this is a bit tricky, but a key aspect of the CSRD. So I'll ask my colleague Thomas, do you think that there's any other relevant information that we should add here?
Well, in all honesty, I'm seeing here Barbara posting in the chat that she says the rebuttable presumption principle was in the older versions of the drafts and got deleted in the November version. Well, we have obviously been gathering a lot internally on what to work with. So in all honesty, it could be that we're referencing on this particular point an older version. I do believe that in the newest version there are still guidance given on making the selection between which topics you should and should not report on, and perhaps very much in line with the thinking of why it might have been taken out is that the whole process of basically justifying why you would not report on certain topics, that can become quite complex as well, and it gives a lot of uncertainty also to a company if you then decide not to report on a certain topic. From our perspective, our advice would already be to in fact disclose on all the topics, both the sector agnostic ones as well as the sector specific ones, because actually gathering just those KPIs is in a lot of cases not the hardest exercise to do, and it will still allow you to use the materiality assessment to really inform on which topics are the most important to give strategic preference and investment towards, and then aligning that with reporting also for those topics that are perhaps not the ones that you're primarily focusing on. So I hope that captures there the essence of what we're trying to bring forth. And yeah, I would propose we move to chapter 4 and have a look at how to conduct materiality assessment. Yes, sorry. So the approach that we have developed for running a materiality assessment really goes through 4 steps. Everything starts with mapping. So we're mapping the system that you're part of, the value chain in which you operate, your supply chains, but also really the stakeholder mapping that you need to do in order to ensure that you include the right stakeholder voices in this process. Just asking Anya here to maybe just click next 3 or 4 times so we have the whole overview here. After you map that, what is important, so we're talking making your topic generic list, knowing who is going to be involved in the survey, knowing who might you want to interview to get a more qualitative overview. Also, what are the different sources that you want to research into in order to get more understanding of these different topics. Then it goes into a data gathering phase. The most important part of that data gathering is doing a stakeholder survey. And in that stakeholder survey, you want to ask the participants to basically review each of the topics that are on your topic list from those 2 perspectives that we just discussed, the inside out and the outside in. And gathering all that data is going to give you a lot of information, right? You both have a bit more, let's say, a quantified way of including the opinions of all your stakeholders, because we're asking to basically position the importance of these topics on a scale of 1 to 7 in the way that we approach it. So that's going to give you a lot of data to include. And then it's going to be layered with the research that you might have done, as well as with the additional interviews that we always recommend to do in order to give more of an interpretation to the data that is coming out from the data gathering. We then take all of that information into an analysis phase where we might look at different stakeholder groups, whether they need to be given the same weight, for example, something that we'll look into in a moment as well. We're looking at what are the big outliers here? Did certain stakeholder groups value a certain topic much higher than others? How do the scores of different topics relate to each other? And in there, really trying to draw out the conclusions that we can draw from those results in order to then synthesize that In our case, we always create a nice report for our clients where we really try to draw all those conclusions, synthesize what it means for the strategic focus that it brings, and really aligning that with making sure that you have a good overview of what are currently the most important topics that I want to focus on with my company. So maybe it's time for a little poll again before we dive deeper into the how-to.
Yeah, maybe with that high-level overview in mind, we had a significant portion of people here today say that they've already conducted a materiality assessment, but also to those who will maybe be conducting this year or have not as of yet, we want to take a moment to understand from all of you, what do you find or have found most challenging about conducting a materiality assessment? So our options here are engaging with stakeholders, attributing weights to stakeholders, prioritizing the topics, and setting targets for the material topics. So while you all take a moment to answer and reflect there on your answers, Thomas, maybe you can offer some insight from your experience and perspective. What has been the most challenging aspect of conducting materiality assessments from your point of view?
Thank you, Olina. I think all of them are challenging. Let me put that up front. I think the engaging with stakeholders is always a challenge, especially if we want to engage with stakeholders that are not as close to the company as our own employees or maybe our direct suppliers and clients. And I know that on the next slide, you're going to be talking a little bit more about how to also expand the perspective of that, but really making sure that all the voices that are relevant to include are included. That can definitely still be a big challenge for a lot of the clients that I have worked with. Attributing weights or different weights to different stakeholders, definitely a very complex process altogether. It needs to be substantiated also with sufficient research in order to really see which stakeholders are most affected by certain impacts. So definitely not an easy task. Prioritizing those topics, once we actually have the data coming back from the materiality assessment, I think it's relatively easier task. So let's see how that comes back. And then setting targets or goals on those topics. It's basically a whole different section again. We have done a previous webinar on that. We also have a goal setting guide that's available for download on the Nexio website. So I know for sure it's challenging, but it is a little bit more straightforward, a little bit less complex than the first two. I'm curious what the poll results say. So yeah, indeed, we're seeing 31%, 24%. So the two highest ones, but only with 1% margin towards the prioritizing of topics and setting targets for material topics. So seeing, I think the challenges that I have seen in the past are definitely those that come out as the highest. But let's also not underestimate the complexity of the other two. And maybe we can touch on those topics a little bit in the upcoming slides, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So in line with the idea of stakeholder engagement, we can go a little bit more into depth about the concept of whose voices to actually include in the materiality assessment. And this comes into place when we're talking about mapping the context that your company operates in. And so it's about determining whose opinions are relevant and who should therefore be included in the materiality assessment. So the diagram on the left here shows an example of how to define these levels of interaction and company engagement that might exist with different stakeholders, while on the right, you can see some examples of said stakeholder groups. At the core, we really have a company's circle of control and ownership. These are your direct stakeholders that you exert the most power on and who exert the most power on you, such as employees or your board members. So these are the voices that you should definitely be accounting for in the materiality assessment. And they represent the people who are impacted and impact your operations on a day-to-day basis. As we broaden up the scope a bit, we have a company circle of influence that expands to those who may not be involved directly, but do have a role to play in your value chain, such as partners and suppliers, for example. And lastly, we have the stakeholders that are the furthest away from the core in the form of the circle of concern and interest. So this could be considered like general public, NGOs, just stakeholders that you may not necessarily see as having a direct influence, but throughout your supply chain, throughout your value chain, will perform some form of role in your operations. Maybe continuing from here to the next slide. To facilitate that definition of identification of relevant voices, we see that it can be useful to map out your industry and company chain, your industry and company value chain stages. So this is a visual of how this plotting can look like, where different stakeholder groups come into play at different stages. And this is meant to ensure that you're not just considering your circle of ownership. You know, you don't want to account for just the people that you're having the most direct relationship with. Because what's important here in conducting a materiality assessment is really to include as many relevant voices as possible. And while this may differ per the company's capabilities, expanding beyond the circle of control and ownership is very important to gaining a holistic interpretation of how those that you impact and are impacted by your company perceive your material topics. So that's mainly how we can perceive that. And then Thomas can guide us through then how to weigh these different stakeholders per their importance.
Definitely, Romina, and thank you for giving us that overview. We can do the stakeholder weighting really on two levels, one per pillar, so on E, S, or G, and determining whether a stakeholder should weigh higher or lower depending on one of those core themes, or and in the end, that's the best thing to do, obviously, is really to go topic by topic to determine the weight that each of the stakeholders should be accredited to in comparison to others. So really listing all your stakeholders first, and then positioning them in this matrix on the scale. On the horizontal one, we see the criterion of to which degree is this stakeholder influenced by the company regarding this pillar or this topic, and on the vertical one, to which degree does this stakeholder group influence the company with regards to this pillar or topic. That is going to give you a score anywhere on that matrix, and we've tried to give a little bit of conceptualization of where that boundary is between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. So you want to attach that weight to each of those stakeholders, preferably per topic, and otherwise on the pillar level. Those scores will then influence in the analysis part the actual it's sort of a multiplier effect to the results that came back from the survey, and with that you're able to sorry, I'm not finding my sentence here. You're able to in the end calculate the percentage of the weight that this stakeholder should have as an impact on the overall score of a certain topic. This is obviously a little bit of an extensive and elaborate process. So in a lot of cases, what we say is like, focus first on the pillar level and see if there's big differences there. As we showed also before, in environment and in social, you can draw a difference between the operational environmental impacts as well as the impacts from products. So you might do a subcategorization there. And on the social side, the same is true for human resources and the human rights elements. So that's one level in between, you could say. Doing it really for each topic does require really a lot more research to explore also how is each of these stakeholders influenced by, and how are they influencing the company in turn, to really be able to determine the stakeholder weight. So maybe if we then check the next slide for an important element of also the CSRD materiality assessment, where it stipulates that we need to not only ask our survey participants, how important do you think that this topic is at this moment, but really framing that along 3 different time horizons, because some topics that are currently already super important might actually decrease a little bit in their importance. In a lot of other cases, what we'll see is that the topics that are currently not seen as super relevant over time start gaining more relevance, right? If we look at topics, for example, around resource scarcity. I think the overfishing example that Romina highlighted before is a good example. As long as the company is able to sell the amount of harvest and sell the amount of fish that they're currently used to selling and continue or even grow their business with that, from a financial materiality perspective, it's not incredibly high. From an impact perspective, we could of course argue that it already is, but the overall score would probably not be super high for the short term. For the medium term, however, that resource scarcity that has served as primary input for your operations is going to be even more affected. So the scarcity is going to increase. Therefore, the relevance of the topic on the financial perspective level is going to increase as well if you look at the medium or long term. So that's really why CSRD prescribes that we use 3 different time horizons to assess each of those topics per perspective to really make sure that the time element is taken into account and that it's asked from survey participants to look a little bit ahead at how might things change and be affected. Then I think, just sort of concluding a little bit on the calculation of things. In the end, we're going to have the stakeholder weight per pillar or per topic. We're going to have the survey results per stakeholder group per topic, and we multiply those with each other, and we have the final score per topic. This is a little bit of a simplification of the actual calculations that are obviously taking place in quite a big Excel file. But this is in essence what it comes down to. How important is the voice? What score did this stakeholder voice give to that certain topic? And that combined as a weighted average gives you the final score. So I'm seeing here a quick question from Sophie, whether all the topics should be plotted on the time horizon. The way that we are doing it is basically within the survey, we have 1 page per topic. And there we ask 2 primary questions. One with regards to how is this from an impact perspective, and how is this from a financial perspective. And for each of those, we repeat basically the question 3 times. So we just have a Likert scale for the short, medium, and long term, so that people can give their view on how that is currently in the medium and in the long term. Let's have a look at the the final result of how it then looks if you put it all together. Oftentimes the way that it's represented is a materiality matrix. So this is also what I think gives best overview for a lot of people. This is what you see back in most of the sustainability annual reports. Reporting is for a large degree obviously the goal for doing a materiality assessment. It often starts with that compliance element that we highlighted before. Obviously, CSRD is very much focused on that, but let's not forget that also CSRD is going to ask us to set goals in what do we want to achieve in the upcoming years. So again, that strategy development and goal setting is super important. Publishing this matrix will also allow for engagement amongst your stakeholders. It will allow for new possibilities for collaboration also throughout your value chain, what we've seen, because especially if you and your clients and your suppliers all end up having similar topics that you want to or should focus on, then collaboration obviously is quite a plausible next step to engage in, which really gives focus to investment and how to align that action, and in the end also really informs how you build and construct your sustainability management system. So the materiality matrix is in a lot of cases the final result of the whole analysis that you do on all the more raw data, layered obviously with the more qualitative interpretation information that you can get through interviews and through that background research. But that's really sort of the final picture that we most oftentimes see it being presented in. I believe that we're already moving towards the key takeaways, and then we will still have a moment for some Q&A. Romina, do you want to walk us through these points?
For sure, definitely. So really quickly, just some key takeaways to get to all of your questions. Really, what we have focused mainly here is on emphasizing the consideration of integrating both financial and impact perspectives on materiality into your evaluations of sustainability topics, particularly because double materiality is the backbone of the CSRD, and companies will have to align with their disclosure requirements starting sooner rather than later, because this will facilitate a lot of work. This mainly involves identifying, prioritizing, and validating material issues, as well as engaging relevant stakeholders, because materiality is an assessment of the company and not a tick-the-box exercise where anything and everything goes. So it's important to really do our due diligence here and conduct the research and the assessment in line with best practice in order to gain that perspective and understanding of how stakeholders understand our impact on the environment, on sustainability topics, as well as how these topics are impacting the company as it progresses. So that's covered here.
Definitely. Thank you for this recap, Romina. I think it's just good to highlight for a moment also how we can support you with the whole process of materiality assessment and everything that comes after. And obviously part of our goals with these webinars is also to really get a good sense of what our audience is in need of, and who might be interested in also being followed up on regarding these topics by our client success team. So please take a moment to think about if there's any services that you would like to further discuss with us. This can obviously be all four, it can be one of these four. You will then at some point be contacted also by our client success team. So the options that we put out here are materiality assessment, sustainability report writing, obviously aligned with CSRD, then sustainability goal setting, and sustainability management system implementation. Take a moment to run through selecting those that you feel you would at some point, can be now, can be later in the future, of course, but that you would need some support on from potentially our side, or that you would at least like to learn a little bit more about. While the poll is still open, we are already going to move towards some of the Q&A. So just turning to our colleague Anya, who has been monitoring the chat to see if there's maybe one that she wants to highlight already at this moment.
Yes, for sure. Honestly, we've gotten a ton of questions, but I'm going to pick out a couple so that we can go through them. Let's see. The first one is, what are the main steps to build the matrix, the materiality matrix that you showed?
Well, I mean, to some degree, it's super straightforward. Your stakeholders give a certain score to a certain topic. They give a score on the impact axis. They give a score on the financial axis. And with that, it determines where the topic ends up on the matrix, right? In reality, of course, it's a little bit more complex because we might be giving different weights to different stakeholders. Therefore, it's not a straight line between score and the position in this matrix. And just linking in another question that I saw here in the chat about how to integrate the time horizons within that materiality matrix. The way that we are doing it is not by, let's say, when we present the results of the materiality assessment to the company under assessment, then we do present how do the 3 time horizons look differently. But what we really want to determine is a weight for these different time horizons, right? So you don't want to say that each of them is valued by 1/3. We have unfortunately not yet gotten a prescription from CSRD in saying you need to attach a certain weight to short, medium, and long term. So that's still a little bit up to debate or interpretation as you might like. But giving a different weight to each of those different time horizons is crucial in order to influence, again, the final score that you give to a certain topic, and therefore the position in the matrix.
Super, thank you for that explanation, Thomas. I see another question from Lotte here, relating back to where we place stakeholders in. I'm just going to go back to the slide in the social system. In what social system can we place customers?
So we have customers here in the connected stakeholders. So in some degree, they're in your circle of influence. In some other degree, they're in your circle of concern or interest. Depends a little bit on the way in which you collaborate with those customers, and also whether you're a B2B or a B2C company, right? If you're B2C, then customers in a lot of ways are a little bit further away. Your line of communication might not be as direct as for a B2B company. A lot of B2B companies, however, I'm seeing really want to collaborate also on the sustainability agenda in order to make sure that they're aligned. So I would say that they're in that case, they're a little bit closer by, but for sure they are part of what we would call connected stakeholders.
Right. Thank you. And I know that we, during the webinar, already gave a couple practical examples or like cases of double materiality. However, we have another question for a practical example or a case of double materiality. Is there maybe something that you want to add here, Thomas, to maybe try to make things even more clear?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we really came across when diving into the CSRD requirements is that a lot of the let's say approaches to double materiality so far have been very descriptive rather than prescriptive. So all of them describe in big lines what needs to happen, but then very few actually go into the nitty-gritty of how do you actually run the assessment and have what needs to be taken into consideration for the analysis. And I think this links to another question that I saw coming by in the chat also. So and maybe this might be something that we can share later as well as maybe a blog article to just elaborate on that a little bit more. But the most important thing is that any topic, any sustainability topic could have already been included from just a single materiality perspective if the indirect effect on the company's profitability or the viability of that company continuing was already clearly affected. So I think the overfishing example, for example, a company that sells seafood sees their input declining is going to hopefully at some point realize that their activities of catching a lot of this fish is having an effect to those ecosystems, but making it explicit that the impact that you're having on that ecosystem in this case is not just something that is of financial concern for the company, but in fact also is an actual impact of the company on the environment, and that's something that we want to mitigate from global sustainability agenda point of view. Actually, biodiversity is one of the SDGs as well. That perspective is something that we've really seen increase over the I would say last period of time, obviously the last years, but the last months even more so. So I think yeah, just building on that example, the acknowledgement of double really meaning the impact of the company on those issues, and acknowledging that that's something of importance for the company to include in their decision making. That's really where we're seeing best practices emerge.
Thank you. And then a question for Romina as well. I see another one in the Q&A box that I believe you answered personally, but I think it's helpful for all of our attendees to understand. Is that materiality assessment should it be based on topics, e.g. climate change, or subtopics, for example, energy?
Yeah, so there is no strict guideline or definition on the scope of the material topics. It can be a very general topic such as human rights, or it can be narrowed down within the topic itself, evaluating, for example, diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is important here is to maintain consistency throughout the topics chosen, and you will see that in our generic topic list provided, as well as to create definitions per what the company is trying to investigate and achieve in these material topics. So to create definitions that are relevant to the company for the material topic. And so it might be the case that a generic topic might include a definition that narrows down into a more specific context, but it would also be the case that they include subtopics instead of a general umbrella topic overview as material topics. I hope this answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. Thomas, anything you want to add?
No, I think what Romina just emphasizes, like, make sure that the topics are at the same level, right? So that you don't have one that's on a high level overarching topic and then another one that's on the nitty-gritty level. In that case, keep them both on the same level, and also accept if this is your first materiality assessment, use it as a starting point, and maybe repeat it in a year or in 2 years. You could even focus much more specifically on a certain stakeholder group, asking them really more fine-tuned questions about particular topics in order to get that next level of understanding even better. But most importantly, keep the generic list that you start off with at the same level of overarchingness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Another question that is a little bit of an advice that I'm gonna see if you have some opinions on both, is how do you suggest to cope with the challenge that stakeholders could be very overwhelmed with the amount of questions in the survey? It might be too long or complex, and that leads to participation being very low. Is there any advice that you can share on this?
Yes. It is a challenge. So I think that's something that we just need to acknowledge, right? The extent to which CSRD is also asking you to really assess along the 3 time horizons, and the amount of different topics that is involved along 2 different perspectives. And basically, I believe we have roughly 25 topics times 2 perspectives is 50, times 3 time horizons is 150 things that a survey participant will have to go through. And let's face it, that's quite a lot. What we've seen work really well is to spend enough time on, let's say, the pre-survey engagement. So to really reach out to those stakeholders that you want to include, both internally. Internally, you obviously have a certain level of control. You might be able to allocate a certain amount of time for employees to take the survey. You also don't have to include all your employees, but make a selection of those. Don't do just those that are most bought into sustainability. Really make sure that you have them from every level of your organization and all different departments. But that pre-engagement matters a lot. Also for external stakeholders, already reaching out. And let's say that you have a procurement officer that has good contacts with a bunch of your suppliers. Those points of contact that this person may have are not necessarily the ones that should be filling in the materiality assessment survey, right? So you want to get them to get in contact with their counterparts, to then get in contact with the appropriate people at your supplier company. Perhaps there's a sustainability officer there that would be the right person to use this lens of analysis. And then, get in contact with them, pick up the phone, use the email, get their buy-in really before sending out the survey. Be very clear about when you're going to send out the survey, how long it will take. We're generally advising at this moment between 30 and 60 minutes. But with the extent with CSRD coming in with the 3 time horizons, we're also still learning from feedback from survey participants about whether that's actually an accurate estimate. Giving even the fact that it's 1 hour, giving a time indication to participants will increase their buy-in. So even knowing that it's going to take a little bit more time gives a higher response rate than leaving it completely blank and basically giving no guidance to the participant on how long it's going to take. So those are a few of the I think lessons that we have been learning over the past period.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, Thomas. A follow-up question is that, well, some of the topics that might be addressed in the survey might not be as well known to stakeholders. How can you deal with that challenge? Apart from the survey taking long, maybe stakeholders are not fully aware of what the topics are.
Romina, you want to pick this one up?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, had a little bit of internet difficulties there, but yes. The question was about understanding how to deal with some stakeholders not necessarily being knowledgeable on certain topics, correct? The important thing here is to create a survey or engage stakeholders in however means you will be doing them in a way that facilitates their understanding of said topics. So going back to what we spoke about earlier, in terms of creating definitions for each topic that are direct and to the point in what we want to measure for a specific material topic. So simplifying the concept, not necessarily with using technical language, and making sure that this is something that anyone, even for example a 12-year-old, could do if need be. So it's important to really help and guide these individuals who may not be as experienced with sustainability issues or sustainability topics, and that way the company can gain the best information possible from conducting the materiality assessment. But it doesn't have to be a full exercise on training on sustainability. It is possible to just include a definition of, for example, what biodiversity means, or what is a greenhouse gas in a survey, or however means the assessment is being conducted, and then that can facilitate the interpretation of said material topic.
Super, Romina, thank you so much. I know it's already 5, but I want to ask one more question, and then I think we will close off for the day. The last question is, if we consider solely the perspective of our stakeholders, how are we taking into account the impact of each topic? Shouldn't we also do an impact assessment in addition? Thomas, can you take this one?
Definitely, Anja. And I'm laughing a little bit because I know that this is the conversation that Romina and I have been having for the last couple of months, where there is already, let's say, the next best thing beyond what we would call a double materiality. So single materiality is really only how do issues in the world affect the company. There's nothing new. Financial analysts have been doing this forever. Now we have the sustainability challenge. Those are issues affecting the company. Double materiality, we start looking at how is the company affecting these topics according to the different stakeholders that may be affected. What comes next, and we do anticipate this to become part of standards at some point. I can't actually give any indication of when that will happen, because we all know that best practice always goes a little bit faster than actual regulation and standards. But it's something that we call triple materiality or context-based materiality. And the primary example I always give, if you own a jeans factory and you run it, jeans, the production of it costs a lot of water. If you do that in an area where water is very scarce, where biodiversity has been basically drying up because of a lack of water, plus you're competing with a local community that is also dependent on that same groundwater for their drinking, then the limit of water usage that would be considered sustainable for your company is much, much lower than when you have the exact same jeans factory with the same water consumption in an area where water is plentiful and there's no competition for that same water source. So I'm seeing here the question from Anna, shouldn't we do an impact assessment in addition? In essence, yes. And what we're currently advising is to do the materiality assessment according to the current standards and regulations. And beyond that, for those topics that were deemed as high on the matrix, so of high importance, definitely follow up with an impact assessment to get a proper understanding of your current impact for each of those topics, to allow that to inform your goal setting. At some point, we will be moving more towards even including all that knowledge into determining what topics are most material. But in all honesty, the approaches for that are not developed sufficiently, and also there's no push really yet from the standards and regulations part in order to bring companies to do that already as part of the materiality assessment. So I hope that this gives a little bit of a sneak preview into what we are obviously already thinking about, that at some point we want to be able to also really offer this to our clients, those that really want to go a step beyond and really do more advanced materiality assessment. But currently, for a lot of companies, the big step will be to move towards double materiality, aligned with CSRD, and we hope that we've been able to give you a little bit of the content and the approaches that we believe can help execute such a materiality assessment.
Absolutely. I want to thank you both for this session. I think we answered a bunch of questions. I know that there are a lot still open, but unfortunately we've run out of time, even gone a little bit over. If you do still want to reach out to us, you can send an email to info@nexioprojects.com. We'll try to get back to you. You can also book a short call with one of our customer success managers through the link that I shared in the chat. But for now, I want to thank you all for your time and attention, and thank you both to our lovely hosts for the day. And wherever you're dialing in from, I hope you have a wonderful evening, afternoon, or morning even. And we will see you in our next session of the CSRD Prep Series.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Bye.